Okay, thanks a lot. So thanks to our two speakers today. We have Emmal Safi, who has a joint job between the National Physical Laboratory, where she's a higher research scientist at the University of Edinburgh, where she's a postdoc, and so she's working on introducing a new instrument into the DARE UK network as part of the methane monitoring part of the project. And we're also very pleased to have Natasha Miles join us. Natasha is an associate research professor at Penn State University in the Department of Meteorology and Atmospheric Science. And Natasha is going to tell us about her measurement work on methane isotopes in a couple of oil and natural gas regions in the US. So I think the plan is that Emmal and Natasha will be aiming for talks of 20 to 30 minutes, something like that, I think. And then so we'll have time for questions after each talk and discussion as well. So I think that's all. So I'll hand over to Emmal Safi now.
Right, hi everyone, I'm just going to share my screen.
Oh, sorry, I think I told everyone to share their video and I didn't share mine. Sorry about that.
Can everyone see my screen?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks.
Right, so everyone can see that?
Yep, that's good.
Okay, right, so hi everyone. As Tim said, my name is Emmal Safi. I am a higher research scientist at NPL and a postdoc at Edinburgh, and today I'll be giving a presentation on a new instrument we've developed that is capable of measuring delta values of methane. So for the purpose of this presentation, I will give a background to the field, describe the instrument that we've developed, how it works, and then present some results that we have obtained. So methane is the second largest contribution to anthropogenic radiative forcing. Reducing greenhouse gas emissions is a major target of the 2015 Paris Agreement to keep global temperature increases below 2 degrees C. In addition to methane emission reductions promised by individual nations, new capabilities are needed to determine whether these reductions are actually occurring and whether methane concentrations in the atmosphere are changing for reasons that we clearly understand. Methane has a shorter lifetime than carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, but despite this, on a molecule per molecule basis, it is a more potent gas, and therefore reducing methane emissions is recognised as an effective option for rapidly decreasing the effects of climate change, especially when looking at the short term, as stabilisation or reduction of methane emissions leads rapidly in only a few decades to stabilisation or reduction of its atmospheric concentration. At present, there is significant uncertainty as to the emission sources of methane on a global and regional scales, and the impact of mitigation measures taken to reduce these emissions is not well defined. So this top figure shows the monthly global trend of methane levels in the atmosphere from 1980 to 2020. And as you can see, it rises from 1980 until 2000, where it stabilizes and then begins to rise again in 2007, and has slightly accelerated in the past 4 years. The cause of this rise is not fully understood, and it may include increased emissions and perhaps a decline in the destruction of methane in air. Methane's increase since 2007 was not expected, or it wasn't planned for at the time of the Paris Agreement. At the time the Paris Agreement targets were set, And if the increase continues at the same rate it is now, it may become very difficult for us to meet these Paris goals. So therefore, there is now a urgent need to not only reduce methane emissions, but to better understand the contributions from individual sectors so we can hold them more accountable. The bottom figure shows global sources and sinks of methane from 2008 to 2017. The main isotopic ratio variations in methane molecules do have the potential to be significant observables when it comes to trying to understand different processes responsible for the global presence of methane. This is because the different sources of methane, so for example, biological sources versus those from burning, release methane with different ratios of carbon 12 to carbon 13. Therefore, measurements of these ratios can give us one way, at least, to pinpoint the source of the variations in the methane mole fraction. So it is clear we need a way to have long-term continuous monitoring of the methane cycle. As we've seen, global temperatures are rising, and they are continuing to rise, and the detrimental effects are becoming more obvious, and therefore individual governments, authorities, private companies and stakeholders are increasing their efforts to help in the reduction of regional greenhouse gases responsible for global warming. However, in order to realise and measure the effectiveness of these reduction strategies against international targets, we need accurate and precise estimates of emissions and their trend. So this image on this slide shows how independent estimates of methane emissions have been made in the past. Oops, sorry. Yeah, so the black bars are the UK emissions inventory. The brown line is the UK emissions estimate from an inversion model using only sites in Methane Island and Cabot sites in Netherlands. I hope I said that right. The crosses are the inversions using the data from all the deck sites. So overall, DARE UK is trying to improve top-down total methane emissions from specific sectors. And one way that DARE is trying to do this is to produce new data sets of high frequency and high precision delta C13 and delta D values from regional sources. And this will hopefully allow us to better understand the emission estimate on these regional scales. So with this in mind, we have developed a new instrument capable of providing these high precision, high frequency measurements of isotopic methane in the atmosphere, which will allow us to better pinpoint methane sources. We have called this instrument Boreas, and it is a laser spectrometer coupled to a cryogenic pre-concentrator. The instrument was built at MPL and sampled air from the roof inlet, from the roof of the lab via an air inlet for approximately 5 months. This is a photo showing you the air inlet of the in the roof, and I think you can just about make it out here. So I'm just going to briefly explain the setup of the instrument, and I'll go into more detail about how it works in later slides. But just so everyone has an idea of the basic setup. So the instrument is composed of 2 measurement parts. In the first part, the air is drawn into the cryogenic pre-concentrator via the air inlet that I've just shown, which then separates the pre-concentrated methane from air, and this then gets flushed into a laser spectrometer, which measures the isotope ratios and allows us to calculate delta values. This is a photo of what the instrument looked like while it was at MPL. We have since deployed the instrument to our Heathfield site at the end of April, and now it is currently is currently running at Heathfield in a testing and optimization period. So just for reference, here are the locations of MPL and Heathfield. They are about 60 miles apart. Heathfield was chosen for its tall tower, and it sits in the southeast of England, which is the most urbanized region of the country and has strong and diverse sources of methane. This photo is showing the tall tower at Heathfield. It is 100 meters high, and the pre-concentrator is now sampling from an air inlet located at the top of this tower. One major advantage of our setup is that it is portable, and by portable, I mean it fits into a van. So here's a picture of the whole setup while it was when it was ready for transportation to Heathfield. And in addition to being portable, it's also relatively quick to set up. So now I'm going to show you a video of a time lapse. This is basically a time lapse of us setting up the instrument during deployment to Heathfield. You can see here, this is the pre-concentrator instrument, and this is the spectrometer. This is the valve manifold that flushes the sample from the pre-concentrator to the spectrometer. It's also relatively quick to set up, and the majority of the setup took about a day to set up. So this is what the instrument. This is the current setup of the instrument, and as you can see, it is it all fits onto a lab bench. So how it works. So just a bit more detail compared to the previous slides. So this is a flow diagram showing you what happens to the air from when it goes into the pre-concentrator to when we can measure the isotopes. Boreas samples air, about 5 litres of air is pumped into the pre-concentrator onto a trap, and then the methane is cryogenically separated from the other gases. Bulk gases like oxygen and nitrogen are not trapped. The trap is then heated while being flushed with nitrogen to allow the methane, which is now about 270 times more concentrated, to be ejected off it into the spectrometer, and the less volatile gases remain trapped. Once the methane has been transferred to the spectrometer, the trap starts to cool again, ready in preparation for the next run. And then the spectrometer records the isotope log spectrum, and then we can calculate the delta values. So this is a figure showing you what the spectrum looks like of the gases coming from off of Boreas. The spectrometer has 2 lasers. 12CH3D is measured using the second laser in the spectrometer, as the absorption signal from this molecule is much smaller than the more dominant molecules, so it is measured in a different region of spectrum. You can also see there's a dotted line. This is where N2O would appear if it wasn't still stuck on the trap. And I'm going to talk about this gas in the next few slides. So this is an example of the data we can produce from Boreas. The top figure shows an example of the instrument parameters we can measure and observe as the sample is moving through Boreas. So this is a strip chart from one measurement cycle. Sections A, B, and C, A, B, C, and D highlight the 4 distinct stages in the measurement cycle. So A is the trapping stage. B is when the methane separation takes place from the air. C is the methane elution stage, and D is the reconditioning stage. The bottom plot, which is a zoomed in version of stage C, shows methane and N2O elution profile during the trap heating when the methane is being flushed into the spectrometer. We can calculate this curve by systematically changing the time in the run at which the sample volume, i.e. the spectrometer, is open to the trap. Each data point represents a result from a separate run cycle. The green bluish box highlights the optimization period that the trap is open to the spectrometer. So the methane peak is therefore completely contained within opening time, and the valve is closed again well before we see any N2O come off. Also, in this way, we know we have flushed all the methane which we have trapped onto the trap into the spectrometer for analysis. So we have these results, and it is now important that we are able to calibrate them. Our setup is such that we are making alternating calibration and measurement runs. So you can see the top bit of this slide is showing you what a calibration run would look like, and the bottom what a measurement run would look like. They're both exactly the same, except in the calibration run we are running mace head air, so air from mace, so clean air from mace head through the instrument, and in the measurement run it's our actual sample. The spectrometer is calibrated separately, while the pre-concentrator's air measurements get referenced to an air standard from mace head. During the calibration run, the mace head air is sampled through the pre-concentrator, while the high concentration spectrometer standards are run through only the spectrometer. The two high concentration standards, so we use these two high concentration standards to bracket our actual air sample or mace head air during calibration run. Calibrating the spectrometer separately means we know the repeatability of the spectrometer separately from the repeatability of the entire system. In addition to this, we have had our standard tanks measured at Royal Holloway via mass spectrometry, and therefore in this way we know the offset of our measurements from that of mass spectrometry. So to summarize the instrumentation part of this talk, we have developed an instrument called Boreas to make high precision, high frequency measurements of methane isotope ratios called high measurements of methane. And it works by sampling air and separating and pre-concentrating the methane and then flushing separated methane into the spectrometer to measure the isotope ratios. A key point to note here is that we are making direct measurements of methane, something that cannot be done using conventional mass spec methods. With mass spectrometry, we would need to collect air sample. We would need to collect the air sample, remove the CO2, and then combust the remaining air CH4 mixture, trap the CO2, and then measure that using mass spectrometry, using the mass spectrometer. This would only allow us to measure the delta C13, and we would need a whole separate instrument to measure the deuterium. Another thing to note with our instrument is we could measure other gases. So, for example, as we've already seen in previous slides, N2O comes out quite close to the methane peak, and our spectrometer is sensitive to the N2O. So, with tweaking the timings, we are able to measure the N2O gas coming off. Also, we do get complete methane transfer from the trap, as highlighted in the previous slide of separation of the methane and the N2O peak, which means we don't really have to worry about any possible fractionation effects. So the results, this is an example of the types of results we can see once the data has been processed from Boreas. These particular results came from Boreas while it was still at MPL between the dates of the 10th of December and the 15th of February. The left-hand axis shows the amount fraction, and the right-hand axis is showing the delta C13 values. The grey line on the plot is the measurements taken from the Boreas target tank, i.e. the mace head tank. And this gives us the repeatability of the instrument, which is on average 0.07 per mil, which is a result of obtained by taking the standard deviation of 4 mace head tank runs over an 8-hour period. Therefore, because we have a good baseline, we can see that any extra noise in the black line, which represents our actual air measurements, our actual pollution, we can say they are actual pollution events, and it's not instrument noise. We can also use Boreas from this figure. If you can see from this figure, we can also use Boreas to measure the amount fraction. And we can measure the amount fraction because we can measure the 12CH4 for the air and standard, and we know the volume of air trapped. And because we know the volume of the air trapped, we also know the pre-concentration factor, which is about 270. Therefore, we can calibrate for an amount fraction with respect to the mace head tank. To measure amount fraction using the conventional mass spec method, we would need to run a bag sample through a Bacaro to get methane concentration and then add that to mass spec, and then add that to the mass spec. With Boreas, this is all done on one instrument using the same sample. So we've seen results for delta C13, but what about delta D? So if you keep your eye on this pollution event, you can see we are seeing an emission source which is drifting away from the baseline. This is the same plot as the previous, but instead of delta C13, this is results for delta D. And as you can see, the same pollution event is highlighted, and you can see it also drifting away from the baseline. Therefore, we are sensitive to pollution events in both in both delta C13 and delta D. And the measurement repeatability for delta D is 0.9, taken in the same way as the repeatability of that for delta C13. So MPL also has a weather station situated on site that belongs to the Met Office. And this image shows the position of the weather station relative to the lab that Boreas was sampling from. And therefore, using the data from the weather station, we could combine it with the results from Boreas to produce some windrows plots. This is an example of some of those plots. And this is what we have from the data while Boreas was being tested at MPL. So the left-hand plot shows results for delta C13, and the right-hand plot shows results for delta D. Each one of these is one measurement. So each of the blobs on the, for lack of a better word, on the screen is one measurement. And the colour is the delta value, and they are plotted with the radius as the wind speed and direction. So from these results, it looks like we're picking up more microbial sources than fossil. More microbial sources than fossil, and you can see on the deuterium side of things, from the southwestern direction, we seem to be picking up more of a fossil signature, which is indicated by the signature being heavier. So these are the kind of results that we can produce when using instruments such as Boreas. We have created an instrument that can make continuous measurements of atmospheric methane, and we currently don't really have another instrument that can do that. We are recording delta values of air using Boreas every hour on the hour, and it's only through having such continuous measurements that we can get enough data to create and see this kind of detail in these kind of plots. So in summary, we've designed a system that can make measurements of methane isotope ratios. These measurements are continuous and high frequency. The system is fully automated, limited only by the fact that we have to change gas cylinders about every 3 months or so. Also, with a single measurement, with a single instrument, we can directly measure delta C13, delta D, and amount fractions using the same sample, whereas with previous methods, we would have involved indirect measurements and different instruments would be needed to measure each. And in some cases, it wouldn't necessarily, each measurement wouldn't necessarily be coming from the same air sample. Finally, the precision of our instrument matches up with those precisions achieved by mass spectrometry, Boreas, and Boreas now is currently situated at Heathfield in a testing and optimization phase before it should start sampling and sampling the air, and hence provide us with results that could possibly help with future greenhouse gas mitigation strategies on a regional scale. So thank you for listening, and yeah, I'll be happy to take any questions that you have.
Oh, thanks very much, Emmal. That was great. Lots of technical detail there. So yeah, does anyone have any questions for Emmal on her talk? I see some applause from people. That's really nice.
I can only see my screen now.
So if you can raise your hand, and then I'll pick you out. So one question I have, Emmal, is how is it looking at Heathfield? Have you got any indication yet, or are things starting to get into place?
So right, so at Heathfield now, we have had, ever since deployment, we have had a few technical difficulties with connections. So the data gets dumped into our system every six hours, but it can only do that if we have the connection. From the data we have seen so far, it's looking good. Everything seems to be working fine, but we're just waiting to get waiting for the connections to be a bit more reliable before we can see any more of that data. But so far, it's looking like it's giving us some good results.
Okay, great. Okay, so if there aren't any questions right now, we can move on to
Tim, there are lots of hands up.
Sorry, I must be in the wrong view or something. Okay, I can't see any hands on my.
If maybe Emmal, if you start.
Okay, yes, very good. Okay, sorry about that.
Right, should I stop sharing?
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Emmal. Okay, so I think, well, Natasha, should we start with you? You had a question.
Sure, thank you, Emmal. That was a really interesting talk. I was just wondering, I think you said that the resolution, the time resolution of your measurement is 1 hour. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, that was it.
Okay.
Is it averaged over an hour, or is it a spot measurement? And then, so what's the sampling period?
Sampling. So it's a spot measurement. We take a sample of air on that hour, and then the air moves through the system, and it takes an hour to move through the system to get before the next one starts again. So it is a spot measurement.
Good, thank you.
So I see Mary Fowler. Is that?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's me, Tim. Ewan Nisbet here. My wife is Mary Fowler. She's stolen my laptop because that has Teams, and she's got a Teams meeting running. So I've got her laptop. That was great. Thank you very much. Your pre-concentrator is pretty heroic, though. At -165, which it obviously has to be. Does that break down? Maintenance of that would be quite difficult over a long period.
Well, while so obviously we deployed to Heathfield at the end of April, but while it's been sampling at MPL, we haven't had, so that in that 5-month period it was working fine. So far.
Okay, that's very optimistic. It doesn't get choked with water or something like that, or something.
Say again, sorry?
Horrible. Well, I can imagine all sorts of things that could happen to it on the way, and
yeah.
it might run for a week or two and then collapse.
Yeah, hopefully we won't encounter any of those, but only time will tell, I guess.
Okay, I mean, it's relevant to the ideas of doing hydrogen using CRDS, because you've got to take out all the water to about -160 before you do the hydrogen. And it's really interesting that you can actually succeed in running a pre-concentrator so well. Thank you.
Wow. No
That was a
worries.
good talk, thanks.
We have, I don't know who it is, SAADAT?
Yeah, that's Sadat.
Oh, hi.
Hi, it's
Go
from
ahead.
China.
Hello.
Hi.
Yeah, actually, my question is, I have worked with this Picaro, so I found that most of these such instruments, which are like online instruments, they have problem with the composition of the air. So if like oxygen concentration is changing, their values are also, the precision level is also changed. So did you check your machine with different composition of the air?
Yes, we have. While the instrument was at MPL, it was running alongside Picaro, and we have compared our results to those Picaro results, and they seem to match up pretty well. So
okay. Yeah, and one short comment, actually, you said the mass spectrometry, we cannot analyze carbon and hydrogen. Actually, we did.
no, yeah,
Yeah, in MPI, Max Planck Institute for Biochemistry, I did it actually there with pre-con guy. I forgot his name. Wow, Willy Brandt. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think maybe I was misunderstanding. I was kind of like trying to get across that you wouldn't be able to do it at the same time. Separate measurements for the carbon and the hydrogen.
Okay.
But yeah, thanks.
Nice talk. Thank you.
That's okay.
Okay, thanks a lot. Anita?
Hi, nice talk, and it's really exciting to see the instrument out and getting some new exciting data for the project. I missed about 5 minutes in the middle, so I apologize if this wasn't there, but I was going to ask about calibration, and I know that you guys have spent a lot of time trying to work out, doing the synthetic standards and things like that, and I was just wondering how that's all working out. And maybe you need to explain to everyone else what's going on as well.
Yeah, no, so far so good. So our instrument's calibrated. So as I was saying, there's two parts of the instrument. There's the cryogenic pre-concentrator and the mass spectrometer. So the pre-concentrator is actually referenced against Mace Head standard, an air standard from Mace Head, so very clean air. So the pre-concentrator is referenced against that, whereas the actual laser spectrometer is we use 2 high concentration methane standards, and that's referenced against that. So we can see the repeatability of each individual part separately, if that makes sense. And yeah, so so with the pre-concentrated side of things, the way we calibrate that, the way we look at the precision of the results from there is that we take we put the Mace Head air through the instrument and take the standard deviation of 4 of those measurements, and then compare that against the result we get from our air measurements, and that's how we measure up the precisions.
Okay, thanks, Emmal. And Christina?
Hi. Yeah, thanks very much for that really interesting talk. My question is about plans for the future. You mentioned something about the next phase of what you're doing with the instrument, but I just wondered, what's the timeline or more plans for the future as to whether you would be deploying more instruments?
Right, so yeah, so as I just said, we've just deployed this one to heat field, and it looks like so far the results look like they're quite good. Yeah, there are plans that we are going to start maybe within the next year to build more of these instruments and deploy them to more sites, so maybe we can get an idea, so we can get more data from different sites around the world, basically.
Thank you.
Thanks, Christina. Thanks, Emmal. That was great. Just on that point about where we go with it. So I think Emmal showed that we've sort of done the calibration side of things. Now we want to prove the instrument in the field, and then beyond that, it would be great to expand out to other sites in the long term. I think that's definitely long term aim.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Emmal.
No worries.
I don't think there's any other. Christine, you have your hand up.
Yeah, sorry, I have another question.
Yeah.
I was wondering about the price of the instrument and how it compares to other instruments.
So that's a good question. I don't think I've actually sat down and totted up the actual cost of the whole thing. But yeah, I'm not sure on that question. Maybe I don't know, maybe Tim knows a bit more about that. So
I think there's a spectrometer is the most expensive part. So that unfortunately is the rate limiting step. It's 150,000. It's $200,000 US. And then the actual cryofocusing part with the valves is more on the order of tens of thousands of pounds. So talking about 50 or 60,000 pounds. So it's not cheap, but compared to two mass spectrometers, I suppose it is on the cheaper end. But yeah, not cheap as a full instrument. Worth it though. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I don't know how much other instruments might cost or how much mass spectrometers cost. I was just curious.
Yeah. I think the thing we want to emphasize as well is that it's obviously established as mass spectrometry. So hopefully over Day UK, Emmal and the team can establish as a robust technique going forward. That would be the aim, I think, and for the modelers in Day UK to actually show that the data is useful. Okay, great. I think so. We'll leave
one more question, Tim, in the chat window.
Yes.
Just come in, Oksana.
Hi, Oksana. I see. Right, chat. How does it compare with optical? Okay, so it is an optical instrument. It is just that there's no off-the-shelf methane instrument that gets these levels of repeatability of precision. And so that's where Boreas comes in with the pre-concentrator, getting the methane up to 500 ppm instead of 2 ppm. That 500 ppm sample does get measured optically. I hope that answers.
Can I just clarify, is it much more precise than Picaro? Because
yes,
Picaro does delta 13 methane online, and it's kind of quite simple to handle.
Yeah, I think other people here might have, I don't know, maybe Natasha's talk will have some, I don't know, but I think the precision is closer to 1 per mil if I understand it with Picaro, but I don't know, but of course we get the deuterium with Emmal's instrument as well. But I think it is a significant improvement on the Picaro.
Yeah, I'll be showing some results for the accuracy. And like you said, we don't get the delta D.
Okay, well, maybe we leave it there and we can come back to this after Natasha's shown her results. Okay, great. Well, yeah, so I'll let you crack on with your talk. Thanks, Natasha.
Okay, I'll go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so hopefully you're able to see my screen now. And thank you everyone for having me here today. As Tim said, my name is Natasha Miles, and I'm going to be talking about our measurements of methane isotopic ratio using cavity ring down spectroscopy in the methane and Permian basins in the United States. Whoops. Okay, oh, there we go. This is a map overview of the shale plays and basins within the continental US, and we've made measurements in 2 of the basins. First in the Marcellus in the Northeast, and there we had a network of 4 mole fraction towers also measuring isotopic ratio. Specifically, we were in Northeast Pennsylvania, and we had those measurements from 2015 through 2017. And we were looking at regional emissions. So trying to get, our domain size was maybe around 100 kilometer on each side, something like that. And then a couple years later, we went back and looked at a very small scale study, just looking at a farmer's field where we did a flux tower measurement looking at the methane fluxes. And then we went in with the cavity ring down to do a very short-term measurement just for attribution purposes. And then in 2020, we moved over to the Permian Basin, and there we have a network of 5 mole fraction towers deployed in late February of 2020. And there we have only one instrument is currently measuring isotopic ratio. Just an overview of these regions. This is the oil production and natural gas production for the Marcellus region on the top and for the Permian region on the bottom. And you can see that the production in these regions has been increasing dramatically over the last decade. They're pretty different in terms of the Marcellus is very dry gas, there's hardly any oil. Whereas in the Permian region, it's very wet, it's sour gas, meaning there's H2S around. And they're very high production for the US. In the Marcellus produces 40% of the natural gas in the US, and the Permian produces 58% of US oil and 20% of US natural gas. So like I kind of mentioned, I'm going to go through our 3 sets of measurements. I'm going to spend the most time on our network of 4 towers in the Marcellus. We had 4 measurements of the isotopic ratio, and we also had, that's where we developed our calibration, and we had the most independent assessments of the isotopic ratio to compare to. Okay, so this is an overview. There's a map on the right. We had 4 towers, north, central, south, and east. The separation between these towers is around 50 kilometers. And we deployed the Picaro G2132i analyzers. We were sampling from 46 to 61 meters above the ground. And you can see our little shed we had installed at the base of the towers. And then inside, we had the Picaro and 3 calibration tanks. One of them we kept independent so we can assess how well we're doing. And then we also at 2 of the sites had NOAA flash samplers, which measures a whole bunch of different things, but also the isotopic ratio of methane so that we can compare. And then we went around with round robin style testing where we had very well-known tanks, and we went around and tested those as well. And this is written up in our paper listed here at the bottom from 2018. The overall goal of the project was to determine the temporal changes in regional emissions of the methane. I'm using both tower and aircraft data. Just a formal Bayesian inversion is a possibility, but that's not what we did. We did an optimization approach. And these are the steps involved with that. You start on the left with your methane observations. This shows the aircraft. The towers could obviously be used as well. And you can see in the track, there's the leg on the east side has high enhancement in methane. And then you start with your prior emissions estimate, and we got ours from the US Environmental Protection Agency. And use your weather model WRF to model what the methane enhancements would be if that was the correct emissions. And you can see it's not nearly high enough, but then you optimize and end up moving up your emissions for the region to get it to best match the observations to determine what the actual emissions were. And using aircraft data from 10 flights in May of 2015, the emissions for that region were found to be 0.36% of the gas production. So very low emissions compared to production. And this is written up in Zach Barkley's paper from 2017. And like Emmal mentioned, you can use obviously the isotopic ratio to distinguish the different sources. Landfill typical isotopic ratio between -65 and -55, agriculture -60 to -45, and then for oil and gas, the range is from -45 to -30 per mil, but there is large variability from region to region. And I'm just going to highlight that a little bit. Actually, this circle is a little bit off. I forgot to move that over. It's actually over here. But in the Marcellus, in the northeast part of the US, the median from this paper in 2020 is -33.8 compared to Barnett, which is in Texas. I couldn't find any references to the Permian isotopic ratio, but in the Barnett, which is kind of close, the median was -41.8. And so it makes a big difference if you're trying to distinguish from the background how far away your source is from that background. And we're way up on the towers, and so the signals are going to be diluted. So our compatibility goal was 0.2 per mil. So let's see. So some challenges for measuring delta 13C with the cavity ring down spectroscopy. There's cross interference with other species, ethane with water, which we dry to avoid that problem, and the CO2, the interference isn't very large, but it is there. It's pretty noisy. Peak to peak noise in a typical atmospheric range around 2 ppm is about 20 per mil. For the raw data, which is every 2 seconds, which is 100 times the compatibility goal. But so we need to average for a long time. And looking at the Allen variances, to get down to 0.2 per mil, we need to average at least half an hour to get down to that, to beat down that noise. And there's also needed to do, you can see on the right, it's a plot of our lab calibration, where we cycled through the different values of known isotopic ratio from -66 per mil to -23.9 per mil. And you can see the error that we get has a linear aspect to it, but it also, the different colors are the different mole fractions. And so there's a spread there. And so there's a mole fraction dependence as well. So we have to take that into account. And you could calibrate separately, you could calibrate 12 CH4 and 13 CH4 instead, but we chose to do it this way. In any case, you're going to have 2 unknowns. So I mentioned a little bit the laboratory calibration that we did. We had these bottles of 2500 ppm methane with different values of isotopic ratio. And we mixed those with different levels of zero air to get these pairs, 16 pairs of mole fraction isotopic ratio. And then we applied equations to account for both of these calibration issues. And then in the field, we had 3 tanks. We had one high tank around 10 ppm. And with the idea being the noise is not nearly as bad if you're up at 10 ppm. And we started out sampling that 12 times per day, but we decreased that and we only did 8 minutes per day. The low tank around atmospheric value at 2 ppm. We started out doing, we did 10-minute cycles, and we did 12 of those per day, so every couple hours. And then the target, we actually started out doing only 10 minutes per day, but we eventually increased that to 120 minutes per day, spread out over 12 cycles. And you can see these isotopic ratios, they're pretty far from what we're going to measure. And ideally, those would have been closer to the background value. But we went with these values based on that's what we were able to get and knew the calibration for. Just some testing results, looking at our independent tank as a function of time over several months and looking at the drift. If we just use that lab calibration, we get the dots shown in the black, and you can see we'd be off by a couple per mil. But if we apply that high tank and the low tank to the results every day, multiple times per day, we get the blue dots. So then the bias is much reduced, and there's still some noise, but we also, when we implemented this optimized strategy, we're able to beat down some of that noise as well. And these are the individual calibration cycles. If we average over those and look at the individual cal cycles in blue, and then the one-day mean in the orange, we're decreasing that drift as well. And then when we implemented the optimized strategy, the standard deviation of the one-day means improved from 0.4 per mil to 0.18 per mil. Okay, and some results from our round robin testing. We had 2 tanks that we had calibrated at NOAA and INSTAR in Boulder. And we took these to each of the sites and sampled each of them for 70 minutes, and then we treated them as unknowns. We ran our normal field calibration tanks as normally, and then we looked at the mean magnitude of the differences. And you can see it was 0.15 per mil for the isotopic ratio of methane. And then on the right, we had 2 sites where we had NOAA flash samplers, and that's the time axis, or the time is on the x-axis, and the difference between the in situ and flask measurements is on the right. And the flasks were only sampled during the afternoon. And if we look at the mean magnitude difference, it was 0.08 per mil for the isotopic ratio. So just looking at some of the results, here's the map again. You can see the pink dots are the unconventional wells, and then our four towers. And the predominant wind direction is from the southwest, so we use the south tower as a background. Now I'm just going to show some plots of the enhancements. So the central tower as an example, subtracting off the south tower to see what the difference is. And so these are 10-minute segments. And this is from January through May of 2016, looking at the afternoon. And you can see here the distribution of that enhancement in the isotopic ratio is only 0.12. So the median isn't even distinguishable from 0. And actually, there's actually very low leakage from this area. And even the standard deviation is not very high. We're not getting very many peaks at all during the day. Even in terms of methane, the median is still not distinguishable from 0. And then the standard deviation is 30 ppb. Now, these are during the afternoon. Similar results for the north and the east towers. But we can use the isotopic ratio to determine the source isotopic ratio. And this is an example of a Keeling plot. This is from Pataki et al. 2003. And the idea here, this is actually for CO2, but the same idea is for methane, of course. You have your background of methane, or CO2 in this case, isotopic ratio here in the upper right. And then you have a source, like if you just said purely the source of whatever you're measuring from. And then you're measuring, each of those measurements is going to be along the line between the background and the source. And so you can follow that line back, follow the slope back to figure out what your source isotopic value is. And so here are our results for the 8 largest peaks measured at that central tower. And these are at night, because then we're getting some significant peaks sometimes. And then looking at the range of these, the mean isotopic source signature is -31.2. And we get really high correlation coefficients And this method is similar to published by Rockman et al. In 2016. And it compares very well with the results that recently came out from Milkov et al., who got minus 33.8 SMPM. And this is a bit of an aside, but to look at, you know, how big of peaks do you need if your compatibility is 0.2, like in our case. And what we have here on the right is the difference in isotopic ratio for various peaks, like enhancements in methane on the y-axis, and for different source isotopic values on the x-axis. And then this black line here is the mean background isotopic ratio. And then anything above these dotted lines on either the right or the left, the peak is high enough that you're going to get a difference in the isotopic ratio that's enough for us to detect. And anything in this more greenish area under the dashed lines, we're not going to be able to detect. So if you, for example, had two sources, like a, say, ag source at minus 55 and then a thermogenic source at minus 35, that level is about 75 ppb. So you need something along the order of that in order to be able to detect it, to distinguish between thermogenic versus biogenic. Okay, moving on to this other experiment we did. This is a very different setup. There was a farmer, and in one of her fields, there were these bare spots, and there was methane bubbles observed in the creek nearby. And so we went there with a flux tower to just measure this very small area. There is a natural gas well about 4 kilometers to the east, so we were first trying to measure what the actual fluxes of methane are, and then using the cavity ring down to try to attribute it to thermogenic source rather than something else. Just an overview picture of where the measurements were set up just in this field. There were a couple different spots we had the flux tower at. We also had chamber measurements, and then walked around with a gas rover to get the methane concentration coming out from the ground directly. And that's what these darker blue spots are. And then, like I said, we took the Picaro there for just a one-day measurement for attribution purposes. And this is the Keeling plot of the data measured there. You can see we ended up with a source isotopic ratio of minus 29 here. We didn't use any of our fancy cal gases or anything, so the accuracy is not as good, maybe around per mil if you don't do any of that stuff. But it definitely seems like that was a thermogenic source of methane. And moving on now to Texas, New Mexico, where we're again looking at basin-wide methane emissions using tower and aircraft. Here's an overview of the map where we have these towers. On the west side, Carlsbad Caverns, Maljamar, Hobbs, which is actually where I am right now, No Trees, and Fort Stockton. And only, which one? Only Maljamar is the one that has the isotopic ratio that I'm going to show. The others just have methane. And the background map is the prior estimate of the emissions. And same idea here, we have a tower, but the pump and the tube carries air to the base of the tower, and then we have our shelter, and inside the shelter, we have the cavity, or the Picaro, and calibration tanks. And here again, we didn't do any fancy calibration. We just have a tank sampled through once a day to get the calibration for the methane, and then the isotopic ratio calibration is probably more like 1 per mil in this case when we're not doing any of our other stuff. And one site also measures hydrogen sulfide, just as an aside. And here's some results for the methane itself. These are only for westerly winds, and these are or like the methane rows, like sort of a wind rows and methane rows for each of these towers. And you can see in the Permian Basin, the methane enhancements are much larger. These are also for the afternoon, but we're averaging for certain wind directions up to 50 or 60 ppb. So the signals are much easier to see out here, for sure. And then we use the same technique of optimizing using weather model and then the tower and aircraft observations. Start out with your prior estimate of what the methane concentration should be, and you can see it's vastly underestimated. Then you multiply by 2.5 to get the best fit to those enhancements that we actually measure with the towers, where are the dots, and then the aircraft is the track in a square. And the results for that, we saw, we got these instruments deployed right before COVID hit. So for the period from March through July of 2020, we found that the emissions changed concurrently with oil prices. They started out at 3.4% of the gas production and then dropped off. You can see down here, there was a drop off when the COVID lockdown happened, down to 1.5% of gas production. And the suggestion here is that when you're under typical price conditions, the Permian Basin is overproducing natural gas, and it's exceeding the capacity of the midstream processors to handle it, and then you end up with higher emissions. And this paper just came out earlier this month. And now, as we got back into the fall and continuing now, we're back up to the normal leakage rate, unfortunately. So we did the source attribution with the methane peaks in the Permian Basin, and honestly here it's interesting. I couldn't find the isotopic ratio published anywhere, but there's not much mystery as to what is causing these methane peaks out here, because there really is not a whole lot else that it could be. And so out here we found the mean was minus 40.8 per mil. And looking at the range of those plus or minus 5 per mil standard error, looking at these 6 different peaks, which compared to Milkov 2020 paper, they found minus 41.8 in Barnett, which is in Texas, but really not super close, but not too far away in terms of isotopic ratio, it seems like. So for the conclusion, we developed an optimized field calibration strategy for cavity ring down spectroscopic measurements. The number of tanks and sampling frequency can be reduced depending on what you're looking at and how accurate you need the measurements to be. But when we did use 3 tanks on site, we were able to determine that round robin flask comparisons and that independent tank test, we got a compatibility of around 0.2 on a 1-day time scale. And using the Keeling plot approach, we were able to determine the source isotopic ratios to be minus 31.2 in the Marcellus and minus 40.8 in the Permian. So both thermogenic sources rather than biogenic. And then the methane emissions were found to be 0.36 of the natural gas production in the Marcellus, but about 10 times that in the Permian under typical conditions, non-COVID conditions. And that's all I have.
Thanks a lot, Natasha. That was a great talk of all your work over the last couple of years. So can we have questions to Natasha, please?
So Tim, I can see that Oksana has posted a question in the chat window. Can you see that? I can read it out if you need me to.
I say yes. So Natasha, the Keeling plot has an assumption of 2 gases mixture. How do you make sure that there is only one source that contributes to the enhancement?
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point. If you had say a landfill, and then further beyond in the same wind direction, you know, some natural gas leak, then it would get mixed, and that kind of analysis would be a problem. Yeah.
What happens if you have cows running around just on your field? Because you have quite a big area of 50 kilometers. How do you make sure that there's no dairy or there is nothing else which interferes?
Right. Well, I mean, I think we're not going to see a very large signal just from grazing. I think when you see those huge methane things, you're looking at factory farm.
Depends how many cows you have. I live in Switzerland. There's a lot of cows there everywhere.
Yeah, I guess it can get tricky if they're both in the same wind direction. Yeah.
And there is no chances that you can look at deuterium at the same time.
The Picaro doesn't measure that. I don't know if they have. I haven't looked if they have developed one. This, you know, we got these instruments 6 years ago, so maybe I don't know if they can measure deuterium or not. Because it does seem like from Emmal's talk that you can get quite different information from deuterium. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Oksana. Heather Graven.
Thank you very much, Natasha, for the talk. We have a Picaro C13 analyzer for methane as well. I don't think they do deuterium. I don't think they offer that. I was wondering, well, you have the 4 analyzers from the Marcellus, and you're using one, I guess, in Texas. Are the other 3 deployed anywhere?
We actually just deployed one here in Texas as well, because we had a different Picaro breakdown. But the other 2 are in the lab, right, being repaired actually, but yeah.
And then could I just ask, do you have an explanation for the difference in the leak rate in the 2 regions?
Well, out here in the Permian, there are, it seems to be like their primary goal is getting the oil. And wherever there's trying to get the oil, the natural gas isn't really, it's not economically beneficial to try to capture it, so they flare it. And so out here, there are flares all over the place. And it's probably a large source of the leakage. And then the flares don't always stay lit. And so sometimes they're just venting methane. And there's apparently nothing to prevent them from doing that, unfortunately.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Heather. Dave, is that Dave Lowry, perhaps?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, hi, Dave.
Hi, Natasha. Great talk there. Just going back to your last set of Keeling plots, there was one that it almost looked as though the precision was the same at the background level as it was for the high concentration ones, which seems surprising given that you know, what I've seen from them and what you were saying before, that I would have expected that precision to be much worse at the background levels than it was as your 1 over methane got towards 0.3 instead of 0.5 or 0.55. So were those Keeling plots as well based on 30-minute averages?
Those were based on 10-minute averages. And I think I understand what you're saying, that as you get towards the background methane, you expect it to be noisier. I did handpick these peaks, and so I only looked where it was clearly a peak if you look at the time series.
Okay.
Yeah, so, right. So there was at least a little bit of a significant enhancement before I plotted it. I didn't go far out into the background.
Right, yeah, it's just I've seen some of those where at background you are looking at plus or minus 5 per mil, and then as you're going along, it's moving towards plus or minus 1 or 2 as you increase the mole fraction. Okay, thanks.
Ewan, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I've changed my name now.
Oh, yeah.
Natasha, it was a fascinating talk. I actually have two questions. Both you can probably answer very simply. First of all, your optimizing method, that's really interesting. How does that compare with other methods, which probably take a lot more computation? Second question was an utterly different question. I was very struck by that paper about how the emissions just depend on the price of gas. And that sort of sent the message to me that it would be very easy for them to actually bring the emissions down if anyone actually bothered in the Permian Basin, because the differential cost is quite small, but I don't know. So two separate questions. Probably answer the optimizing one easily, and the other one is just opinion.
Yeah, I think the optimization technique, we're actually working on paper where we're looking at what we've learned in the Permian, where the signals are big, so it was easier to make good progress. And then the plan is to compare the optimization technique to the typical Bayesian inversion. So we're working on that. I suspect it will be very similar. We've tried a lot of experiments with using the optimization technique with, like, let's say, what if you didn't have one of the towers, leaving one of the towers out, how much effect does that have? And it seems very robust.
Okay. It's actually quite similar to what you use in seismology, where you generate synthetic seismograms and try to fit your signal. And that seems to give very good answers. Presumably it uses far less computational powers. Can you sort of do it quickly on a laptop?
Yeah, I mean, you still need to have the WRF runs. But once you have that, I think it's very easy to run and very easy to experiment with, in terms of, leaving out certain towers, or what do you do? You look at how WRF did compared to the OBS for that day, for the weather OBS, and if WRF is doing terrible, you throw out that day, kind of things like that. And then you talked about the gas prices as well, and you're right. It just seems like it's totally feasible.
It's just crazy.
Yeah, right.
It's money going in the sky. It's tomorrow's money, and why do it? Yeah, I'm sure there are reasons and immediate reasons to do with making a quarterly target, but even so.
Right, and apparently they're allowed to do this kind of thing where they're just venting or flaring. And it's a shame.
Okay, thanks, Ewan. Anita?
Hi, Natasha, thank you very much. I was just wondering about whether you guys also thought about looking at ethane measurements and whether that offered something, we're talking about different things that you get out of deuterium, what ethane could potentially tell you as well. And, if you have any sort of field calibration strategies for that you could, couple onto this.
Yeah, it would be interesting to add ethane. And I know in some other experiments in Texas region, they've used ethane, and it can really be helpful in terms of source attribution as well. These instruments actually do have an ethane line that they report on. And we tried to do, because there's interference from ethane with the isotopic ratio, and we tried to eliminate that, but then we found that the ethane is just not very good from the Picaros, so we weren't able to look at that specifically with this instrument. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I think, was there another question from Oksana? Did you look at VOCs?
No, we didn't. We have done some sampling of VOCs. We've been very interested in the VOCs, particularly out here in the Permian, where there's small towns mixed in with gas wells surrounding them. So I think measuring the VOCs would be very interesting, and we've tried doing a few of that, but yeah, we don't have any continuous measurements. Although at Carlsbad, they have a separate group measuring ozone and VOCs. So there could be some information that we could get from there.
Okay, thanks, Natasha. So does anyone else have any questions for Natasha? Are there any questions generally for Natasha and Emmal on any of the two talks? So I think, yeah, thanks, Natasha, for getting up early for this. And I think, I don't know, it's really impressive work how you've managed to, you know, you went all the way from optimizing a Picaro system through to marrying up the economics of gas prices. So it's pretty cool stuff. So hopefully we can emulate some of this in DARE UK over the next couple of years. Okay, so are there any other last thoughts? Ewan, I think you had your hand up again.
Yeah, Natasha, sorry, I'm in the middle of a thunderstorm, so I'm muting and unmuting. Your methodology seems widely applicable and quite robust. If you were to look in other parts of the world, Mozambique, for example, you know, clearly there's United Nations pressure to set up long-term monitoring of emissions from major gas fields, so as to basically check on global mitigation agreements. It looked to me as if your system could be automated in quite a big scale and not too expensively. Is that a fair comment?
Yeah, I mean, we, between my colleague and I, we are running at times 20 instruments. They're not any harder to, well, they're not much harder to run than the normal Picaro, just measuring CO2 and methane.
I'm sure they break down just as often.
Yes, yes, they do. But yeah, but time consuming, but not difficult, let's say.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Oksana?
Thank you. And I just wanted to remind everybody at the last GMT meeting, we had a presentation on the capacity development project or technical cooperation project, which we do with our International Atomic Energy Agency. And the purpose is explicitly to increase the capabilities of the countries to measure isotopic composition and to use them for the climate mitigation. And we are at the stage of, let's say, developing the good practice document. And I don't know, Natasha, if you were in contact with Peter Sperlich. So he is coordinating the inputs to this good guidance document. And that's particularly for the optical instruments measuring delta 13 in methane. And then we are also developing the terms of reference for the potential training centers that can actually train on the basis of those good practice documents. We had a discussion with China now that potentially they can host such a training center. And the colleagues from IEA are talking to some labs in Argentina so that a similar lab can be established in Latin America. And I just wanted to bring it to the attention of the community that this project is going on. So don't be surprised if you're contacted by Peter or somebody who works with him to provide inputs on this good practice document. And it's very important that to develop this good practice document, which actually takes into consideration the good practices with their running with optical instruments and calibration and potential troubleshooting. And also don't be surprised if we ask anybody from this community to be the trainers to actually help the other countries to perform such measurements. And yeah, Picaro is maybe not such an expensive instrument in comparison with their new system, which is developed in UK. But for the majority of the world, which is like 90% of the population, the Picaro will be not affordable. So we try to do through the technical cooperation with a nuclear agency who have a little bit more money than more. Thank you. It's just a comment, so that they would try to pull it up together on a global scale.
Thanks a lot, Oksana, for bringing that up. I know Peter's been talking to people about a round robin exercise of the methane isotopes. I don't know if you know about that, Natasha.
No, I hadn't heard about that.
It might be worthwhile to hook you into that. Okay. Okay, so unless Oksana has another question, which I don't think she does, I think that's all the questions.
That's an old hand. Now it's
Okay.
The most favorite statement. You're muted, and that's an old hand. So let me remove the hand. Okay, great. Well, I think that's all then. Yep, thanks again to Natasha and Emmal for 2 great talks. And Aoife, I don't know if you've got anything to finish with.
Yeah, just thank you. It was a great discussion and super talks as well. And it's great to see lots of kind of interaction across the water as well. And I just wanted to say about our next seminar. It's on Monday, the 14th of June. And it's about national CO2 inverse modeling. So if anybody doesn't have the details to join that and they want to join, then just email me. Anybody external as well, that's you're more than welcome. Just get in touch. And yeah, thanks to our speakers, Natasha and Emmal, and thanks Tim for chairing as well.
Thank you. Nice to meet everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.